I found out my neighbor was stealing my power and water. Years ago, I was working a FIFO job. FIFO means fly in, fly out. I'd fly to a mine for 2 weeks to work, and then fly back home for a week. Rinse and repeat. It was a lot of hard work, but I was making a lot of money. I was a Sparky that's an electrician and I could fix just about anything. I made a lot of money working at that mine. It made me feel like I could do anything I wanted, like anything was possible. So, I decided to buy an old house to fix up. I wanted to make it into something beautiful. My friends who worked in construction helped me with the work. Those are my guys, you know. We'd drink beer, eat barbecue, and work together. I loved hanging out with them. We had a blast. It felt like a family, except better, because there was way more beer. The house was a one-story place. It had 4 bedrooms and a huge shed. It was on a half-acre of land, which is pretty big enough for a good-sized backyard. The old owners had lived there for a long time, 25 years, so the house was a little rough around the edges. It needed new paint and some repairs, but the bones of the place were good, you know? Solid. I felt good about getting started. The first day I moved in, some of my new neighbors came to say hello. There's usually 2 types of neighbors who show up on the first day, the casserole-bringing type, and then there's the Bill and Jenny type. Bill was a retired lawyer and Jenny was a retired doctor. They weren't super friendly. I felt like I was giving the "this is a quiet neighborhood" lecture. They'd lived there for over 20 years and seemed to think their neighborhood was in some sort of quiet zone. I tried to explain that I'd be working on the house, but that I wasn't going to throw loud parties or anything. I tried to be polite, but they weren't convinced. They weren't happy that I had a FIFO job, and they seemed worried about me messing up the neighborhood. They glared at me. Their faces turned into sour expressions, like I'd just sneezed on them. They talked about the neighborhood noise laws, and how quiet their neighborhood was. It felt like they were really trying to intimidate me. They even said that everyone was proud of their gardens, almost as if I didn't know how to take care of plants. "Everyone around here has pride in their gardens," Bill said, with a smirky grin. I wanted to scream. I hate grass. It's the worst. But I just smiled politely and let them walk away. There were some good neighbors, though. Dave and Beck, who lived on the other side of the fence, were awesome. They brought over beers, pizza, and their kids. They even told me that Bill was always giving people gardening advice that no one asked for. Dave was a school principal and Beck was a nurse. They seemed to like me from the very beginning, which made me feel good. "Our kids are excited to have some new friends to play with," Beck said with a smile. I had a good feeling about Dave and Beck. They were good people. The next week, I got to work on the house. I needed to make it a home. I checked the plans the previous owners had made to build a big deck and decided to go for it. I was going to have a big, beautiful deck, stretching along the back of the house and halfway around the side, and maybe even a roof. I had a vision, and it was going to be amazing. I called up my people and asked them to make sure the old plans were still okay and get me all the permits I'd need. Then, I checked on my lawnmower and got the backyard all cleaned up, just to make sure I wasn't getting any complaints from Mr. Grumpy Pants. Bill. I could see him looking out his window, watching me every move I made. A few months later, my first big utility bill came in. It was time to take care of my bills and start keeping my records. Years ago, when I moved into a place, I always started a special notebook for my utilities. I'd write down my power meter readings and my water meter readings. It was a good way to keep track of everything. If anything went wrong with my water supply or my electricity, I could see if I was using a lot more or a lot less. It was really helpful. Now I had a real bill. I could start using my special notebook again. That's when the trouble started. I decided to change out the electrical switchboards in my house and shed. To do that, I needed to shut off the power at the main switch outside. That cut the power to my entire block. It was kind of like a mini power outage. While I was changing out the switchboards, I thought I might as well do a complete check of the electrical wiring in the house. That was something the city would want me to do before selling my house. But I found something really weird while I was working. The wiring that went to the shed didn't test out right. I looked at the results, and something just seemed off. And then, I saw Bill outside. He was watering some flowers with a hose, by hand. He always used his automatic irrigation system for everything. It's a complicated system: sprinklers for the lawn, mysterious for his flower beds, and even drip irrigation for the plants in his pots. It felt really weird. I felt a shiver of suspicion go through me. My heart beat faster, and my gut told me something wasn't right. Something was fishy. I decided to finish the electrical work and worry about the shed wiring the next day. Maybe there was something wrong with the underground wiring, or maybe someone had hooked something up without me knowing. The next morning, I called up a friend of mine who was a real electrician. He helped me out a lot. He had some special tools. He said it was like a metal detector for electrical wires, which I thought was pretty cool. With the help of his tools, we were able to map out all the underground wiring around my house. We found that the wiring for the shed was about a foot inside my fence line and went to the main power meter at the front of my house. About halfway between the house and the shed, I found something totally unexpected. It looked like the electrical wire to the shed had a little branch coming off it. That branch went into Bill's property. It was really bizarre. But wait, we found something else weird. The water pipe for the shed also had a branch going into Bill's property. I'd been suspicious about Bill before, but now I was sure something strange was going on. I marked all the underground services with orange spray paint, and I had a gut feeling this wasn't going to be a normal kind of project. I decided to finish the electrical work in my house and think about the problem some more. My brain was buzzing. I knew I had to figure this out, but I couldn't let Bill know I was suspicious. I knew he wouldn't take it well. The next day, I called a real professional. I told them about the plans for the shed and Bill's pool, and asked them to find out when the pool and shed were built. I also called a security company and ordered a couple of cameras and a recording system. I needed proof. I felt like I was planning a spy mission, but my goal was way more mundane, catching a thief. I spent the next couple of days preparing. First, I hammered some stakes into the ground, marking out the spot for my big, beautiful deck. I made sure Bill didn't see me. I had a good plan for the cameras, too. I positioned one to catch the power and water meters, and the other to catch the area around Bill's pool house. It was all perfectly legal, of course. No one could argue with a homeowner putting cameras around their property. Then, I had a special meter installed just for my shed circuit, so I could track how much electricity it was using. Then, I went to Bill's property and checked out his irrigation timer. I set mine to match his, just in case. It felt a little strange, but you've got to think like your opponent, right? There was one final thing I had to do. Before heading back to the mine, I turned off the power to my shed. And I also shut off the main water valve for my property. I took pictures, made notes in my notebook. It was time to catch Bill red-handed. It was going to be a long 2 weeks. When I got home, the first thing I did was check my power meter. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was being used. The numbers had changed. Bill was turning the power on while I was gone. Then, I went and checked my water meter. The readings had changed. Someone had been turning the water on too. Bill had been taking my power and my water, and he was doing it without permission. I raced to check the cameras, my heart pounding in my chest. I saw Bill standing at his pool hut the day after I left. He looked confused, like he wasn't sure what was going on. Then, he walked out of frame. I saw him on the other camera. He was staring right at my meters. I watched as he turned both the water and the power on. My anger started to boil over. How could he? Then, I saw Bill walk back to his place and check his irrigation system. A few minutes later, his sprinklers turned on. I couldn't believe it. It was clear as day Bill had been stealing from me. It was time for him to learn his lesson. I needed to make Bill understand the consequences of his actions. I was going to make a bigger hole for him to fall into. That was when phase 2 of my plan went into action. I watched Bill from my porch, carefully keeping a close eye on him. He was out in his garden, taking care of his plants like he owned the whole world. That's when I went into action. "Hey, Bill," I called over to him. I wanted to make sure my camera caught the conversation. I wanted Bill to see himself doing something wrong. "Hey, Bill, did you see anyone messing around with my water and power meters yesterday? They're at the front of the house, right near the road, right?" He came over to my fence and looked at me. "No, I didn't," he replied. I gave him a big, phony smile, hoping that he'd start to feel guilty. But he just smirked. He didn't care about what he had done. That's when I decided I had to take things into my own hands. Before I left for the mine, I turned off the power and water again, but I did something a little different this time. I placed 2 special out-of-service tags, one on my shed circuit and one on the main water valve. I dated the tags and snapped photos of everything, just like I learned from the cops back when I was younger. It was like a game of cat and mouse. I just had to wait and see if Bill would take the bait. When I got back from the mine, the tags were gone. Bill had been back and turned everything back on again. It was time for a final showdown. This was going to be phase 3, the ultimate revenge. Here's the thing about Bill. He'd been in his house for over 20 years. The shed was built around the same time as Bill's pool, about 10 years ago, according to the professionals I talked to. And I knew that Bill's pool pump house had been built specifically to hold his pool pump, his filter, and his entire irrigation system. I started putting 2 and 2 together, and I knew exactly what Bill had been doing. It felt like I was playing a game of detective. He had been stealing water and electricity for years. My mind was racing with thoughts about Bill's dishonesty. It made me mad, but I was going to keep it cool. He could have been nice about the whole thing. Maybe we could have worked something out or shared our meters. But that's not what Bill did. He was sneaky and dishonest, the biggest B word. I couldn't let him win. It was time to show him how it felt to have someone messing with your stuff. That weekend, I went to visit some of my best friends. I asked if I could borrow a few things for my little project. I had an idea brewing in my brain, and it was a good one. I needed to turn my house into a fortress, a place where I could fight back against Bill and win. I felt like I was preparing for war, but it was a different kind of war, one of patience and strategy. I got back home and headed straight for the shed. I grabbed a big drum. It was big, about 200 liters, a really big one. I filled it up with water and poured a whole big bag of salt, and the salt was the key. I knew it. I set up a special dosing pump. I'd learned how to use them working at the mine. I wanted to make a little secret delivery system. I had to find a way to get the salt water to Bill's garden. At 2:00 a.m., I woke up. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The house was sleeping. I turned on my headlamp. It was almost like a scene out of a spy movie. I had to make sure I stayed out of sight. I sneaked outside and turned off the water valve at the front of my house. Then, I ran all the water in my house. I knew the pressure in my water pipes would go down, and I could then safely work on the pipes. I knew I had to do this really carefully, so I didn't mess up my system. It was time to strike. I grabbed my tools and dug a hole next to the branch that went to Bill's house. I wanted to make sure I was working under the cover of darkness. I knew it would be too risky in the daytime. The ground was soft, but there were some really tough roots from the trees nearby. I finally got to the water pipe that was heading to Bill's house and carefully attached a special fitting to the pipe, a tapping saddle, and hooked it up to a piece of plastic tubing, almost like a siphon. It felt really good to finally be taking action. I filled in the hole and replaced the grass. You couldn't even tell I'd been there. I ran the tubing along the fence, hidden in the grass, and then connected it to the dosing pump I had set up in my shed. Everything was set up a secret saltwater delivery system. The last step was to turn the water back onto my house. It took a few minutes for the pressure to build up. I knew Bill was going to be in for a big surprise the next morning. I went back to bed, my head racing. I felt exhausted, but I also felt powerful. I had done it. I had set my trap. The next day, I went next door. It was time for the final confrontation. I knocked on the door, hoping to get Bill alone. I was still trying to be respectful. I needed him to come to me, but it was time for the truth to come out. I needed to let Bill know that I knew everything he had done. Jenny answered the door. She had been keeping Bill's secrets. It was obvious that she was hiding something. She stared at me, a look of shock on her face. It felt like a game of poker. "Jenny, I need to talk to you and Bill about your pool and irrigation," I said. "We have nothing to talk about." She snapped and started to close the door. "If Bill wants to talk, he knows where to find me," I said before the door shut. It was a game of chicken. I knew that this might be an extreme reaction, but I've been through a lot. You might think, whoa, this is a little dramatic, but this is how Bill had been treating me since I moved in. Bill and Jenny constantly complained about the noise I was making with my power tools, even though I never started before 9:00 a.m. and I always finished before 5:00 p.m. We were pretty far apart too. I was making too much noise while they were trying to enjoy their gazebo time. Bill and Jenny would call the police every time I had my friends over. They even called about the music. I had the radio playing low. It seemed like they wanted to get me in trouble. We weren't even loud or rowdy. Dave and Beck didn't care and came over for barbecues anyway, and I loved their company. One day, Bill went ahead and cut down one of my trees. He just took a chainsaw to it while I was at work. He said it was too close to his fence. It was totally rude. It had been there for years. He could have asked me about it. Bill even went behind my back to try to stop the city from approving the plans for my big, beautiful deck. He wanted to sabotage me at every turn, and it felt really unfair because the city had already approved the plans. It was like he just didn't want me to be happy. This was more than just stealing water and electricity. He was a true bully. I was not going to let him get away with this. That afternoon, around 5:00 p.m., I saw Bill's sprinkler system start up, turning on his big garden. And guess what? My dosing pump started pumping the salt water too. That was when Bill realized what had happened. I was sure it wouldn't take long for him to notice. At 2:00 a.m., I sneaked out again and removed the tubing I had hidden in the grass. I was ready to disappear. I cleaned everything up and left. The next morning, I returned the drum and pump to my friend. I went back to my house, ready to finish the job I had started. I started digging up the trench where the wires and pipes were buried, all the way from my meters to the shed. I didn't want to leave any trace, and I needed to do this right. I needed to dig up the whole thing. It took me the whole day to dig. The ground was hard and I kept hitting roots. But I kept going. I stopped to rest, then I continued digging. The branch to Bill's property was next. That's when I saw the pipes and wires going into his yard. I knew this was the final moment. It was time for a showdown. I called out to Bill and Jenny, who were standing on their porch. "I'm replacing the wiring to the shed," I said, "and I'm going to have to cut this section out so I can finish the work." They stared back at me with their angry faces. I knew they understood what was happening. "Bill, this is the pipe and the wiring that's going to your property. There's no way you don't know. Why are you trying to make this so difficult?" They denied it. They always denied it. But I knew it was all over for Bill. I jumped over their fence, determined to take back what was mine. I got to work, carefully pulling the water pipe and wires out of the ground. It was a satisfying sound, that ripping and tearing of the wire, the pulling and pulling and pulling. It was like justice had finally been served. When I finished the job, my friend, the plumber, came over to fix my water pipe. I gave him a smile. It felt good to have friends who could always help you when you needed them. The salt did a number on Bill's garden. Everything wilted. The trees started turning brown and yellow. If he'd watered it right away, maybe he could have saved some of his plants. But by the time he noticed what had happened, it was too late. It felt a little bit satisfying to see his garden turn from vibrant green into a wasteland. I could only imagine how annoyed Bill was. Bill confronted me the next morning. He was furious and threatened to sue me. But I had all my proof. My utilities diary, the photos of the meters, the security footage of Bill tampering with them, the out-of-service tags and pictures, and the records about when my shed and his pool had been built. He could sue me, but he wouldn't win. There's nothing you can do, I told him, and walked away. He was really upset, I could tell. He was all puffed up, shaking with anger. It was really strange, like he was ready to explode. A few weeks later, I sold my house. It was time to move on, to start a new adventure. I was going to find another fixer-upper and start over. I was excited to create something new. It was just like starting a new chapter in my life. I was glad to be rid of Bill. It was great to have that big, beautiful deck. And, all that drama with Bill made me appreciate the good neighbors even more. Thanks for listening. It's been a wild ride.